Shiran, Yakshir, Lao Shao, Iran warns ceasefire collapse, after deadly Israel strikes, that a ceasefire that was never fully real is now cracking apart in real time. Iran has issued a direct warning to Washington. If Israeli strikes continue, there is no ceasefire to protect, no framework to negotiate within, and no diplomatic channel worth maintaining, and the strikes have continued. That warning was not a press statement designed for optics. It was a message delivered through back-channel intermediaries, through state media, and through the unmistakable language of military repositioning along Iran's western border. Tehran is telling the world something very specific, that the architecture of any possible peace agreement is collapsing under the weight of decisions being made in Tel Aviv, decisions that Washington either cannot stop or will not. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to resist the temptation to treat this as a story that began with a single incident. What is unfolding right now is the convergence of multiple pressures, military, diplomatic, economic, and institutional, each building separately for months, each now feeding the others in a cycle that no single actor fully controls. The world is not watching a managed crisis. It is watching a situation where control itself is the central question, and the answer, at least right now, is that no one has enough of it to guarantee the outcome. Start with the incident that shattered whatever fragile ikichuri igurur tao ki furl and fo free kim film exao existed before it. A United States military pilot went down over Iranian territory. The official American account described this as a rescue operation. C-130 transport aircraft, Apache attack helicopters, dozens of special operations personnel inserted into a highly sensitive theater. Washington presented the narrative as a search and recovery mission, a military obligation to one of its own. The framing was careful and deliberate, and nothing in the official language suggested aggression. Everything was cast in the vocabulary of duty and protection. Iran immediately offered a completely different account, and they did not offer it quietly. Iranian state officials, military commanders, and government spokespersons all stated with notable consistency that what the United States called a rescue mission was in fact a direct military strike aimed at the Isfahan nuclear research facility. One of the most heavily defended sites in the country. Iran's version did not describe a chaotic encounter or a lucky intercept. It described a planned operation that failed. Their air defense systems, they claimed, detected the incursion early. The objective was clear from the approach vectors and equipment involved, and what the world was being told by Washington bore no relationship to what had actually occurred over Iranian airspace that night. Now, here is the part that makes both accounts impossible to simply dismiss. Washington has stated repeatedly that Iran's enriched uranium stockpile had already been neutralized in a strike conducted the previous June, that the most critical components of Iran's nuclear program had been destroyed or rendered inoperable. If that claim is true, the question that follows is obvious and uncomfortable. What exactly were U.S. forces targeting near Isfahan? The full details remain classified, but the gap between the two official narratives is not a minor discrepancy. It is wide enough to drive the entire subsequent diplomatic breakdown through it. When neither side's story fully holds together, and when both sides know the other knows it, the already limited space for trust disappears entirely. Before any of this became public, something happened inside American military leadership that appears far more significant than it was treated at the time. The top Army general was removed from his position, not retired, not transitioned in an orderly succession, removed. The official explanation pointed to a failed military transformation initiative, years of planning, significant expenditure, and results that fell well short of what had been promised. That is a legitimate institutional failure and might be sufficient justification on its own. But the timing cannot be easily separated from the context. This removal happened in the days immediately preceding the escalation that turned a tense standoff into active conflict. The general had reportedly communicated internally that the trajectory being considered was dangerous. That operational risk was not being weighted appropriately and that the environment was more complex than planning accounted for. What the record does show is that the person designated to lead the United States Army through its most complicated engagement in years was no longer in that role before the first bombs fell. His replacement inherited a crisis already accelerating beyond what any public accounting had suggested without the institutional memory that shaped the decisions preceding it. The ceasefire attempt that followed was, in strategic terms, an unusual spectacle. The United States, the country that had initiated the bombing campaign of Afghanistan, was the party pressing for a pause. Iran had not asked for a ceasefire and was not the actor under pressure to stop. Iranian forces and the broader regional network aligned with Tehran had demonstrated significant capacity to absorb, respond, and sustain operations in ways that made a quick American military resolution unrealistic. The pressure for a halt was flowing in one direction, and it was not flowing from Tehran. A 10-point peace framework emerged, reportedly drafted in Washington and delivered to Iranian officials through Pakistani diplomatic channels, a signal in itself of how constrained direct communication had become. Had Trump reportedly accepted the framework structure, then it leaked. The domestic backlash was immediate and intense. Conservative media, political allies, and Israeli officials all pushed back hard. Within roughly 24 hours, the White House reversed course. The 10-point document was declared obsolete. New terms were being developed, officials said, though those terms were not disclosed and remain unknown to anyone outside a very small circle. A high-level meeting in Islamabad was das Tercertiner and now a was Tasbeindaukens. Senior American officials, including figures whose diplomatic roles had already raised significant questions among regional actors, flew in for direct negotiations. Iran's position on the delegation's composition was clear. 2 of the 3 men sent by Washington were viewed in Tehran not as representatives of American national interests, but as proxies for Israeli strategic preferences. Russian officials had separately and on the record expressed similar reservations. Iran publicly stated a preference for dealing only with the 3rd member, whom they regarded as someone actually operating within the framework of American interests. Despite these objections, and reportedly following a direct call from the Israeli Prime Minister insisting the delegation remain intact, the meeting proceeded with all 3 present. The structural problem this creates is not subtle. When one party openly distrusts 2 of the 3 individuals sitting across the table, and when that distrust is grounded in specific assessments of whose interests those individuals are actually serving, the likelihood of reaching an agreement that holds is severely diminished before a single substantive point is discussed. Iran's central condition for any meaningful ceasefire has been stated with consistency: the bombing of Lebanon must stop. Not paused selectively, stopped. Tehran's position is that a ceasefire allowing Israeli operations in Lebanon to continue while Iran and its affiliated forces stand down is not a ceasefire at all. It is a managed outcome dressed in diplomatic language. Israel's position has been equally consistent and directly opposite. Israeli officials have stated, with Washington's acquiescence, that Lebanon cannot be included in any ceasefire terms. Accepting that exclusion would give Israel continued freedom of operation in a theater Iran considers directly connected to its own security architecture. This is not a negotiating gap that can be split down the middle. It is a fundamental contradiction in the basic definition of what a ceasefire means. And it is the reason that every framework appearing so far has either collapsed before implementation or never reached the threshold of a genuine agreement. Trump, by nearly every credible account, does not want this conflict to continue. And yet every time Washington constructs a path toward an exit, the architecture of the American-Israeli relationship narrows the doorway until nothing can pass through it. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. Let that register, because it is easy to process that sentence as a geopolitical data point and miss what it actually means in material terms. Roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply moves through that narrow waterway. When it is closed, not threatened, not at elevated risk, but actually closed to normal commercial traffic, consequences begin cascading through the global economy within days, not weeks. Tankers that had already departed their origin ports turned around mid-ocean. Fuel prices began rising in markets with no immediate domestic alternatives. Food supply chains, deeply dependent on fuel costs for refrigeration and transport, came under pressure. Insurance rates for regional shipping spiked to levels making many cargo movements economically unviable even before factoring in physical risk. Russia, currently operating outside the full reach of Western energy sanctions, is reportedly generating an additional $250 million per day in oil revenue as a result of the disruption. The logic is direct. Global demand has not dropped, Hormuz supply has contracted sharply, and alternative suppliers with available capacity are capturing Price-Mel and Bursal. Now we show price premium. Japan, South Korea, and several Southeast Asian economies have already been outbidding European buyers for Russian crude. Tankers routed toward European terminals reversed course and redirected toward Asian ports. Europe is now absorbing a second wave of supply instability during a period when its strategic reserves are more strained than at the start of the previous energy crisis. China's situation deserves particular attention. Approximately half of China's petroleum imports originate in the Persian Gulf. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is not a distant inconvenience for Beijing. It is a direct threat to the energy supply powering Chinese manufacturing, transportation, and industrial output. China had warned Washington in the weeks before the escalation that this path would create exactly this disruption. That warning was direct and specific. It was ignored. China is now pressing Iran through its own channels to accept some form of operational pause, not because Beijing supports Washington's position, but because China cannot sustain this level of supply disruption without consequences its leadership is not willing to accept. That pressure from Beijing on Tehran is real, but it operates against a countervailing dynamic Iran has introduced with significant strategic effect. Iran has signaled that any country not aligned with the American and Israeli position in this conflict and willing to settle energy transactions in yuan, rubles, or rupees rather than US dollars can expect to move through the strait without interference. The signal is not primarily logistical, it is monetary, a direct challenge to the dollar's role as the denomination of global energy trade, a function central to American financial power for decades. The world is paying attention with a seriousness that reflects how much underlying frustration with dollar dependence has grown. American debt now stands above $36 trillion. The ratio of that debt to gross domestic product is moving in a direction that financial analysts now describe with alarm rather than caution. The 10-year Treasury bond yield is being watched closely. Some analysts have suggested that if it approaches 5%, the sustainability of American debt servicing enters territory that forces difficult decisions about spending priorities. Military operations are not free. Extended naval deployments, sustained air operations, special operations missions, and logistical support across multiple theaters carry costs that accumulate daily. Every day the strait remains closed adds pressure to an economic environment that was not positioned to absorb it without consequence. Ukraine continues to burn. That conflict has not resolved and continues to consume Western military industrial capacity already stretched across multiple simultaneous demands. NATO, as a functional alliance with shared strategic vision, is under internal stress that goes beyond the kind of periodic friction it has historically managed. European governments are accelerating plans for strategic autonomy that are so there and thus down there for in defense investment and foreign policy frameworks that do not assume American leadership as a reliable anchor. I start for first show at a pace that would have been politically impossible 2 years ago. The post-Second World War alliance system that defined Western security for 8 decades is not dissolving in slow motion. It is moving at speed. China, Russia, and India each warned against this path before it was taken. All 3 were ignored. All 3 have now been proven accurate. That alignment, the warnings, the dismissals, the subsequent validation is being noted in capitals around the world with implications that extend well beyond this conflict. The message being absorbed by governments in the global south, in Southeast Asia, and in parts of Africa and Latin America is that American strategic judgment that preceded this escalation was flawed, and that the countries which identified those flaws before the fact had a more accurate read than Washington did. That perception does not simply dissolve when a ceasefire is eventually signed. Analysts with direct regional experience have noted that a ground campaign in Iran was never a realistic option, regardless of how the air campaign developed. Conservative estimates suggest such an operation would require a force of roughly 1 million troops, a number the United States cannot field for a sustained engagement in that geography. The population is large, the territory expansive, and the terrain deeply unfavorable to the maneuver warfare American doctrine relies on. Iran knows this. Iranian military planners have structured their defensive posture around exactly this reality, and the asymmetric advantage they hold in a ground engagement is not a surprise to anyone who has looked at the operational math seriously. What Iran is doing diplomatically is equally calculated. By setting conditions it knows Israel will reject, Tehran maintains the position of the aggrieved party, responding to unmet demands rather than the belligerent prolonging a conflict. By directing its statements about the downed pilot incident at Washington's credibility rather than at American military competence, Iran isolates Washington diplomatically without giving it a clear military target to rally support around. By offering alternative shipping terms in exchange for yuan and ruble payments, Tehran applies economic pressure on American financial infrastructure simultaneously with military operations. These are not improvised responses. They reflect a strategic framework developed over years, executed with a coherence that has surprised observers who underestimated Iran's capacity for sustained multi-domain pressure. The forward picture, as best as it can be read from observable behavior and historical pattern, suggests several developments worth watching closely. The Islamabad talks are ongoing, but the structural conditions that made previous frameworks collapse have not changed. The trust deficit between Iran and key members of the American delegation is a genuine obstacle, not a rhetorical position. Unless that composition changes, or unless external pressure, particularly from China and European economic partners, becomes severe enough to force a compromise, neither side would accept voluntarily. The talks are more likely to produce a temporary reduction in activity than a durable agreement. The Israeli position is the single most unpredictable variable in the equation, and Netanyahu's government has domestic political incentives that are not aligned with Washington's economic and diplomatic interests. A ceasefire, including Lebanon, constrains Israeli operational freedom in a theater where Israeli leadership sees active strategic value in continued pressure. The pressure needed to change that calculus would have to come from Washington in a form the current political environment makes extremely difficult to apply. Without that leverage being exercised, Israel's effective veto over any agreement's terms remains intact. The dollar's role in energy trade is not going to be decided by this conflict alone, but this conflict is accelerating a conversation already underway. The offer of yuan and ruble-denominated passage through the strait is the most visible signal yet that non-Western governments are actively exploring alternatives, and that those explorations now have a concrete operational example attached to them rather than remaining theoretical. If even a fraction of regular Persian Gulf energy trade shifts toward non-dollar settlement in the aftermath of this crisis, the long-term implications for American monetary power extend well beyond the current military engagement. The question of what comes next for American military leadership is unresolved. The removal of the top army general before the escalation began left a gap in institutional continuity at exactly the wrong moment. The incoming leadership is navigating one of the most complex operational environments the American military has faced in the post-Cold War period without having shaped the decisions that created the current situation. Institutional memory and continuity of judgment matter in sustained conflict. When they are disrupted at the senior level precisely when they are most needed, the probability of miscalculation, not malicious, not deliberate, but the kind that flows from incomplete context, arises. Here's what has fundamentally changed. Before this escalation, the US-Iran standoff was a managed confrontation with established signals, implicit limits, and mutually understood red lines. Both sides, despite hostility, operated within a framework that prevented full-scale conflict. That framework no longer exists. The rules that governed the previous equilibrium were broken when bombs fell on Iranian soil, when Iranian air defense systems engaged American aircraft, and when the official accounts of what happened that night diverged so completely that neither side could claim good faith. Rebuilding even a minimal framework requires trust that is not currently present and cannot be manufactured by a single diplomatic meeting in Islamabad. However senior the delegation, the ceasefire Iran is now warning could collapse is not a solid agreement under strain. It is a fragile, contested arrangement that has never been fully implemented, whose terms are disputed, whose enforcement mechanisms are non-existent, and whose survival depends on two actors, Israel and Iran, making restraint decisions their current strategic incentives do not support. The warning from Tehran is not a bluff designed to extract concessions. It is an accurate description of how thin the thread holding this situation together actually is. What you should be watching for in the coming days, whether the Islamabad talks produce any documented agreement or dissolve into competing characterizations of what was discussed, whether Israeli operations in Lebanon show any signs of restraint that might give Iran a basis for extending the Khamenei and for Escalate, whether China applies visible pressure on either Tehran or Washington in a way that shifts the diplomatic calculus, and whether the U.S. Treasury yield moves in a direction that forces an open conversation about the fiscal cost of continued engagement. This situation is more constrained, more volatile, and more consequential than it was 72 hours ago. The options that existed before certain decisions were made are no longer available. The actors still in the room are working with a narrower set of choices under greater time pressure, with less trust between them, and with more external pressure from a global economy absorbing real damage every day. This continues. That is not analysis designed to alarm. It is the clearest description of the current strategic environment that the available evidence supports. This report is based on observable developments and strategic analysis, with some details still evolving as events continue to unfold.